Good morning. My name is Daniel Thomas, Chief Business Correspondent at the Financial Times, and welcome to this joint WPA and NWEC webinar, which is part of a series by the WPA exploring the future of cities. Today we have an excellent panel to discuss business rates reform, which for many city centres, and the West End in particular, will determine how high streets recover from COVID-19. Neither retail nor property is faring well in the pandemic, putting them often at odds as the lockdown has hit consumer demand and caused a savage drop in revenues. But certainly on this one subject, they are aligned that the government needs to reform business rates finally and fully. The government has offered a holiday on rates until the end of April, but already businesses warn that they need an extension or further mitigation. Otherwise, disaster could ensue, given the threat of further COVID restrictions. But the calls here are not new or related simply to COVID. There's been a growing drumbeat to overhaul or replace business rates for many years. The government is now consulting on reforms closing at the end of October, making now a critical time to come up with other ideas. For the Treasury will not forego the money that is much needed to help the nation's balance sheet, and so creative solutions must be found. But that's a lot to talk about, and so let's move on to the session. First of all, I'd like to introduce and indeed thank our speakers. We have Mark Gifford, who's Executive Chairman of Debenhams. We have Councillor Rachel Rebatham, the leader of the Westminster City Council. Jace Tyrrell, Chief Executive of the New West End Company. And last but not least, Paul Williams, Chief Executive of Derwent London and the WPA Vice Chair. We will start off with a presentation by Tony Travers from the London School of Economics, who will put this big issue into a political context, and also try to explain some of the complexities and options in just 8 minutes before he also joins the panel. Tony has also been commissioned by NWEC and the WPA to draft a white paper on business rates to help shape their responses to the ongoing government consultation. We'll also, I should point out, we have 2 Zoom polls during the discussion, so please do take part and we can have a look at what the results are as they come in. And any viewers with questions for our amazing panelists today should use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, not the general chat function next to it. And I will try to put those questions to the group as we unfold the debate. So with that, Tony, over to you.
Okay, Dan, sorry, I just dropped my pen, so that's why I suddenly flinched. Good morning, everybody. And what I want to do is to talk for 7 or 8 minutes about this perennial issue of business rates. And as Dan has said, the Treasury is examining it as we speak. But of course, particularly for city centres, in the short term, business rates has become an absolutely key question about the viability of a number of businesses this year and next. But I'll come on to that. Now, just a few facts. We love banding around data on these subjects, and it is worth noting that the yield of business rates in the City of Westminster was expected to be, I stress was expected to be, £2.3 billion in 2021. That was 9% of the 25 billion total for England. And if you look at the neighbouring authorities of the City of London, where it was £1.25 billion, and Camden, where it was nearly 700 million, these 3 authorities in the West End and City together represent 16% of the England total. Now, that means that business rates are important for at least 2 reasons. One is they're important to the City of Westminster itself, to the council here represented by its leader. They're represented partly because Westminster's status is preeminent in this regard. No authority in the country had a yield, apart from the City in Camden, which was somewhere behind anything like the scale of Westminster. And also, as the yield went up or down, given various retention type schemes that the government has introduced over the years, changes in the yield can affect spending, and particularly this year when, as it turns out, the yield for business rates in Westminster and other authorities is going to be lower than was predicted. And of course, separately, the impact of the tax affects occupiers and landowners. There's an obvious impact. There's a tax on property. The UK has relatively high taxes on property, so there's an immediate impact on those who occupy and properties and running businesses, and obviously on landowners, who in the end are often those who bear the full impact of property taxes. But it's also, as a tax, important to the exchequer. And just to put a simple way of putting it, if you look at that big yield I've described for Westminster and the other two central London authorities, if that yield were to halve, I'm not suggesting it will, by the way, but if it were to halve, then business rates in the rest of the country would collectively have to pay 10% more in business rates. This is a closed system. It's designed to produce the same amount of money from year to year, even if there's a revaluation. So if business rates were in the long term to fall in the City of Westminster and the other authorities in central London, then businesses elsewhere in the country, including the rest of London, would end up paying more. Now, of course, the short-term impacts are profound, and particularly on sectors hardest hit. So retailers, restaurants, hotels, leisure organisations are heavily concentrated in central London, particularly in Westminster. And of course, the relief that the government's offered on business rates runs till the end of 2021, whereas the impact on these businesses and others are going to continue into 2021, 22, and I fear, for 1, 2 or 3 years beyond that. I mean, we're in the middle potentially, and I thought this was really interesting in the Chancellor's statement last week. He signalled a structural change in the economy. So he is now expecting a structural change in the economy, and central London will definitely not be immune from that. There was supposed to be a revaluation, which has been postponed, but now there is one due to take place in 2023 based on 2021 rental values. Well, best of luck in anybody, including the valuation office, working out whether 2021 rental values represent any kind of evidence in the medium term as to what rentals are going to be beyond that point. So there's a short-term need to ensure that businesses are not faced with anything like full business rates in 2021, 2022, and for some time thereafter. And of course, this COVID-determined requirement doesn't affect the need for longer-term reform. And Jace is here on the panel from New West End Company. NWEC has commissioned substantial research in the past. The WPA is also looking at this issue, Westminster Property Association, our hosts today. And all the authorities, particularly Westminster, have a vested interest in this being got right. Now, what about the Treasury's view about this kind of thing? Well, as Dan said, there is a consultation on the future of business rates underway. I think it's fair to say that hitherto, from the Treasury's point of view, the business rate's steady and predictable yield has made the Treasury pretty unenthusiastic about risking losing any part of that. So they've continued to want to collect that 25 to 30 billion. And I think you can see how, I mean, there have been early reviews of business rates, but they haven't actually led to anything other than a series of release for smaller businesses. Actually, they're not smaller businesses, they're businesses below a particular rateable value threshold, which means it's helped businesses outside inner and central London much more than those within it. So the only thing that was a real change was the move to 3 yearly revaluations. That will marginally reduce instability, but of course the instability that we now face, Westminster's businesses face, and indeed the whole country faces, is far greater than any revaluation would ever have produced. So NWEC and others have looked at possible options for the longer term to replace the part or all, this is about I'm going to finish, of business rates with a tax that would make more sense given modern retailing and other patterns. So the options include the possibility of moving to a higher rate of value added tax to replace existing business rates in part or in whole, or a local sales tax. Many American cities will all have gone to America when we were allowed to and paid sales taxes on top of everything we thought we were going to pay, or a turnover tax. And that could be a turnover tax on one sector or on the whole of business. And in each of these cases, it would make it easier, I think, to argue that such taxes affected online business in a way that was fairer to retailers and others who have got shop fronts or are working out of high streets and main streets in central London. Now, of course, some of these are more appropriate than others as a local tax. It's harder to imagine local VAT being as effective a local tax as business rates, but a sales tax easily could be. So there's an issue for local government in all of this. Finally, of course, no reform would be easy. There'd be winners and losers. Winners never cheer, losers always moan. There'd be redistributive impacts, and the questions of exactly what they are is one I can remember when I was involved in the work for NWEC, trying to work out who wins and who gains in the, if you make these kind of reforms in the medium to long term is quite a challenge. So finally, COVID-19 is going radically to change the economy of Westminster, the West End more generally, and the city, and indeed city centres outside London who are in very similar kind of position. I would argue business rates need short and longer term reform. We are going to have to do this against the need to reset the UK economy. And the fact that all of this is going on, you could say, could provide a stimulus towards greater radicalism. Unless changes are made, there are distortions, and there will continue to be distortions and undesirable consequences for the economy. And those distortions feed through into the operation of the economy more generally and employment possibilities, both locally and nationally. So my final thought is this: after COVID-19, radical change is no longer an impossible option. Thanks.
Radical change for this government doesn't feel impossible at all, to be honest, after the last 6 months. You're right. It's but really well set up, I think, for this discussion now. No easy outcomes, clearly, and there will be losers as well as winners in this debate. So but Tony, you mentioned modern retailing, and I'd like to come first of all, Mark, to you to address this point. That retailing was changing before COVID, obviously. The shift from the high street to online was happening at pace, and it's happened even quicker in the last 6 months after the pandemic kicked in. So, so clearly, just can you give us your thoughts about the retail landscape, how it's changing, and indeed how the impact of business rates has been on your portfolio and your decision making in the last few years, and then we can maybe throw it forward after we get a sense of where you are at the moment. We get Mark? Mark, you're on mute still. Sorry, Mark, you're on mute if you can hear me. Fantastic.
Is that? Can you hear me now? Yeah. Thank you. Sorry. Business rates have really had a profound effect on Oxford Street across the West End nationally. But if I just focus on the Oxford Street West End impact for today, most retailers and all the ones that I'm involved in, the Oxford Street West End was all about flagship locations. I'm going back 10 years ago. These were amongst the most profitable stores that all of these businesses would have had. Since the 2010 rating list was replaced with the 2017 rating list, if I just take all the large stores on Oxford Street, whether that is Selfridges, whether that's John Lewis, that's the Debenhams, the Topshop, they've all increased the rateable values by over 60% in that last rating list. This has been an enormous burden on those businesses, and before the pandemic started, a lot of those businesses were seeing their flagship locations, some of the most profitable stores they were operating, become loss-making stores. It was very significant. So you had cost increases being experienced in the business with higher business rates, and you were seeing sales decline across a lot of those businesses when you've got competitive factors such as a Westfield Stratford opening, a Westfield White City extending, and the enormous amount of online growth. So you're seeing pressures on your top line and enormous cost increases, fixed cost increases converting what were our best stores into loss-making stores that, you know, were very hard to justify continuing to operate from. This was all before the pandemic. If I use some of the businesses I'm involved with, so the Ann Summers business, the Debenhams business, all the stores on Oxford Street were loss-making stores and the biggest loss-making stores in the business. So it was a problem before the pandemic. What we are seeing right now is the slowest recovery in sales performance is in the West End of London. So if I quote some of the figures, you know, the best in the businesses that I'm involved in over this period has been a 50% level to pre-COVID. Typically across the street, it might be 30% of last year's level. So when you've got the business rates burden that's, you know, could return in full in April next year, this is going to the heart of whether those stores are permanently closed. And hundreds of job losses are what we are facing, not just the business I'm involved in. I know Jace has got a lovely statistic. You know, if you go and speak to all the retailers, that may well be 2/3 of the stores are now unviable. And there is a real risk that we shut a large parts of London, central London, because the footfall is not there, and the whole system with the rental costs and the business rate costs have made central London very uneconomic to continue to operate. So today is about that message. There's urgent requirement for reform overall for the longer term, but just short term, any thought of returning to a full business rate is just irrational. It will cause enormous job losses and unnecessary store closures. There needs to be a continuation of the holiday, or at least a 70% reduction going forwards into next year.
Gosh. And Jeremy, I know we're talking about London here, but is it just a London problem, or, you know, do the regions also have their other issues?
So city centres are by far and away the biggest impacted cities. So if you do tourism, we would have seen in the business I'm involved in, London being the worst, Edinburgh being second worst, but there's still a lot of tourist traffic in the Manchesters, the Leeds, and all those cities are affected, but not as markedly as both Edinburgh and London. Now, there's also an office worker community, and the level of return of those office workers, so it's most acute in city centres than it is in suburbs, outskirts, where instead of people, you know, they're working from home, they are visiting those more local shops or retail parks where they feel safer. They are not feeling safe enough from a commuter perspective or a day out shopping to return to city centre locations, with the West End by far and away the biggest impacted location in the country.
Yeah, gosh. And just before we move on, I mean, obviously you've laid out a really, you know, a pretty devastating picture here for retail, which is just you know, for anyone who's been following the last 6 months, perhaps unsurprising in many ways, it's been a, you know, awful time with the lockdowns. I mean, but what is in your mind the solution then? I mean, it's to come to Tony's point, it's not easy, is it, to find you know, a way where everyone wins this one. So, but, you know, in your mind, what needs to happen? Is it simply just let's have the holiday and see what happens, you know, going forward, or do you propose something a bit sort of more transformational?
No, obviously the nation needs an effective tax system, and there's no substitute for the collection of the tax that hasn't been collected this year directly from this business rates holiday. There has to be a fairer way of doing this, so it's spread across more industries. If you do the analysis, the retail industry is bearing an unfair level of tax, and we do need to level the playing fields across the different sectors of British retail. And whether it is a sales tax, whether there's an online tax, it needs to have a fuller review. But if without that, we are going to see areas of non-food retail having unnecessary level of shutdown and closure with job losses. It's just the way it takes effect today will cause that without significant reform.
Yeah. It's such a big topic. I mean, retailers is just right in the centre of the storm. Rachel, I mean, just to come to you, I mean, obviously, Mark's talking about just this devastating effect on central London, and almost what estate agents are calling the donutting, aren't they? The push to the suburbs, people staying at home. I mean, and this clearly comes to a big point about the viability of the city. But first of all, and I'd like to come to that. But first of all, take me through the business rates for you guys, because you take in about two and a bit billion in rates every year. What currently happens to that money? And I mean, clearly you'd be loath to lose it, wouldn't you, given your own needs to support the area?
Yes, I think it's very important that people understand that whilst business rates in Westminster currently, obviously not for the current year, but has been running at about 2.4 billion in the last year, Westminster City Council, so our local area, keeps only 4% of that. So it is important to stress that this business rates goes into the national pot. We only retain 4% of that. And I think that is really relevant as we go forward, because obviously this is money that we need to look at how much is retained locally, because certainly the City Council is doing a huge amount in terms of investment in the public realm and, the way that we manage the city, which is all around how we support our businesses and work with our businesses to encourage more people to come in. So I think that's an important point. But going back to business rates as a whole, as everyone here knows, as you've rightly said, this is absolutely critical for our businesses. And I think Tony's very right to divide this into a sort of a short term and a longer term. And the short term point is that we do need to have some continued relief. And if we can stretch our minds back to March in the budget, when the Chancellor, before lockdown, when the Chancellor announced the business rates relief, I immediately realised in Westminster that just didn't work, because what was being proposed was a cap at 51,000 of business rate value, which would have meant that only 4% of our businesses would have benefited. So on the very day of the budget, I wrote to the Chancellor highlighting this, and I'm very pleased and welcome the fact that he did then raise the cap for all businesses, because otherwise the vast majority of Westminster's businesses would not have had this business rate relief, and it would have been very difficult for them to survive. And as Mark eloquently stated, the retail sector, particularly in the West End, is still really suffering, particularly because people are not feeling confident about public transport still. They're not coming into the city centre in the same numbers. We don't have the international tourists. And therefore, to assume that business rates, that we could approach this cliff edge of the end of March and business rates return to their previous value is simply not deliverable. So I have been pushing the government to look at it, some kind of extension, because clearly businesses, as Mark said, are still not trading at levels where they could reasonably anticipate that they could be able to pay anything like a normal business rate. So we have to look with government at how we could extend that. And the other point in the short term, and I increasingly feel this very strongly, is that we have to really, all of us, continue to make the case that the West End is, and Westminster as a whole, is really suffering, and its importance in terms of the overall picture for the economic viability of the country. Tony mentioned we produce 9% of total business rates, so there will be no levelling up in Sedgefield or anywhere else unless West End business rates continue to flow. And we need to keep doing that, because I think the government needs to really remember how important this is. And the reason I say that is we've just seen the government's announcement regarding duty-free tax, which will save them 500 million in the West End. But actually the wider impact of that is so much bigger, because that will act to deter even more people visitors coming into the West End and shopping there. So the West End can't absorb these losses. We need to have measures to help them get up and running. Looking at the longer term, first of all, I would say that I really welcome the announcement of a reform. We have long been saying that it just simply doesn't work for Westminster, in particular, the business rate structure. And just to give a very stark point, and Mark mentioned this, in the last business rates review, so between 2008 and 2015, in the West End, business rates, rental values went up by 80%, but over the same period, sales went up by 30%. So a property-based tax, as this is really painful for Westminster. And it's anticipated that over the next year, sales may well halve, probably if we're lucky. So if you continue the same business rates system, it is simply not tenable. So we need to look at how that works going forward. I would like to look at the business rates retention scheme, so how we make sure that more of the business rates that's generated by our businesses working with us in Westminster is retained for the local area to reinvest in the local area. And going forward, I know that the government is consulting on only 2 options. That doesn't mean to say we can't put forward other options, but they're consulting on an online sales tax, which we would absolutely support, and a capital values tax. And I think that we should argue or look very closely at how we could persuade the government towards a more revenue-based tax, because I think anything to do with capital values is going to simply prolong this unfair burden. But the final thing I would say, and we can, I'm happy to take more detailed questions on any of those things I've just said, but the final point is that I think for those of us in Westminster, we must speak with a united voice. We must argue the case together for Westminster, because we need to be really clear and really strong in terms of our messaging back to government. This is incredibly important, the reform of business rates, both in terms of the short-term measures, but also the longer-term measures in terms of how we support our businesses to get back on their feet. And what happens now, I think, will be critical for the longer term future of the West End. So we, the bids, WPA, NWEC, all of the individual businesses, we must speak with one strong voice in terms of what is best for us in Westminster, in terms of getting our businesses back up and off the ground. And of course, that nationally will be good for the entire country, because we accept that Westminster and central London will remain the economic powerhouse for the foreseeable future for the national economy.
Yeah, very well put. I mean, just many people won't have the same access as you have into the halls of Whitehall and central government. And how sympathetic do you think Treasury number 10 Bayes is to these arguments, to both the business rates arguments and the need to find a more flexible and effective way to tax, but also, the sense that the centre of London is important to the rest of the country, even as they're talking about levelling up in red wall constituencies and so on and so forth?
Well, clearly the government was elected on, back less than a year ago, feels a lifetime ago, less than a year ago. And one of their key agendas was on levelling up, as we know. And I think all of us, or many of us, would absolutely support that. But clearly we're in a different environment now, and we cannot have the money available to level up, to invest in some of these other more economically deprived areas if you're not supporting the golden goose to continue laying the golden egg. And that is why it's so important that we work with our West End and Westminster businesses. And certainly I know in some areas there's a view that the West End can absorb these costs. It can't, certainly not at the moment. And so I wouldn't say that government doesn't understand it, but we just need to absolutely keep reinforcing the critical importance of this, that the whole of the government's economic agenda, and I'm not exaggerating there, given the size of the business rates that we've been talking about, 9% of the total, it is really important that we continue to reinforce this message and emphasize that the West End needs help to get up and running.
Yeah. Thank you, Rachel. I mean, just the first poll results have come in to the question of what do you think should happen with business rates to the people watching. By far and away, the most popular option is tax online sales to reduce the business rates bills. That's an online sales tax. To come to your point about the consultation, that seems to be vastly popular with the people watching. And maybe later on we can come back to that, actually, because I think it's a big topic, and Mark, I'd like to have your views. But first of all, Jace, I mean, we were talking earlier, and Rachel's just set out the kind of the problems that Westminster's having and Central London are having. And we were talking earlier about footfall going backwards. It was about 50% returning, now you were saying almost 2/3 down again year on year. So just take us through the picture of the West End. I mean, what how bad is it at the moment out there, and how can businesses, how can the government and businesses respond to this with the business rates consultation?
Thank you, Dan. And it's really sobering, isn't it, to listen to Mark and just some of those numbers and the jobs. And we see them as numbers on a page or, in the media, but actually these are people's lives and livelihoods that we're talking about. And we should remember that. And it's really just sobering to hear that.
Sorry. Terrible. Very bad webinar technique there.
We're still 6 months in. So, look, it is really challenging. We were thought we turned a corner by September. We all thought actually the office market would start to return in terms of colleagues coming back to work. We've had fantastic response from customers and colleagues feeling very safe in the West End. So when they're in the stores, the restaurants, the retail, moving around the streets, the measures that Westminster put in place. So, customers and colleagues feel safe coming here, but actually the announcements have been a step back. And let's face it, we're now looking at 6 months potentially. And until we have a vaccine or really, really effective track and trace, we're not going to shift the dial. My message, to anyone that will listen is the West End is very much open. So look, you might not be going back to the office as much, but actually the stores, the restaurants, the hoteliers are open for business this Christmas. And please come and support it. We have to remember 1 in 10 Londoners actually work in the West End. So when we talk about these jobs being lost, it's not just in Westminster and Westminster residents, this is the whole of London that will be impacted. And actually the West End retail supports about 160,000 jobs in manufacturing all around the UK. So it's important to remind ourselves of that. I just want to give a couple of stats because I know Tony gave some as well, but just in context of our district in the West End, so principally Bond, Oxford and Regent Street. I mean, out of the 4.9 billion that pre-COVID, the West End used to contribute to the Treasury, 4.9 billion in surplus taxes that weren't coming back to Westminster, that were contributing to the wider economy of the UK. 1 billion was paid by businesses in Bond, Oxford and Regent Street a year pre-COVID. So a significant chunk of that. And as Mark suggested, I think Rachel raised this point, if you look at sort of the 10-year period, rates went up. I think the average was about 70%, 80%, but some businesses it was 120, even 140%. And sales were maybe 30%. So it's fundamentally flawed, the system that we have. And we all recognize that. So I think there's unanimous agreement here that radical change is needed and fundamental reform. But I think, the points being made, short and long term, the short term, of course, we have to avoid that cliff edge. And you think about where we were earlier this year, we thought maybe we'd be 50% down this year. Normally we turn over 10 billion. We thought at some point maybe we would claw back 5 billion this year. That was a very sort of high-end trajectory. I think now we're looking at over 12 months from March, maybe 2 billion. So an 80% drop in sales. So this thought that we would go back to 100% business rates next April is totally irrational and will just cause the collapse of so many businesses and more jobs. It will have an impact right across the country. And the point Rachel made, this tax-free decision, it's a very narrow view. Treasury have looked at this. They think they might be saving some VAT in central London retail, but actually they're losing 3.5 billion of other taxes around the country from tourism and the economy. So we just ask them to look again at the cost benefit of this, and look at how damaging that decision could be for the wider recovery. So I think we all agree, avoid the cliff edge. Tony alluded to the fact that we've sort of got 2 years, or he has said there's 2 years sort of between 21 and 23. So we need to think about whether that's 100% holiday. Maybe it's 50% around the country, but where there are high city centres of tourism, like the West End, that rely on international visitors, perhaps it's 100%. So maybe there is some areas of the country that were more impacted that need some of that holiday or that relief or fiscal stimulus for a bit longer until we fully recover. Because let's face it, there's going to be an almighty debt. The Treasury needs to sort of get back tax receipts, don't they? And actually, we need the West End to bridge and get through this period, but obviously start paying back taxes to get the economy back on its feet. I think one thing, though, in the longer term, and I know we talk a lot about online versus physical and this idea of an online sales tax, which the government's minded to do, we think perhaps we could broaden that. So rather than online, perhaps look at the VAT. And actually, if we say 22% on online transactions, and not just retail, but that could be anything from booking a holiday to buying software, a 22% rate on VAT would raise about 12 billion. And actually that 12 billion could be used to offset some of the physical businesses. So whether it's online sale tax or VAT, I think the principle of actually collecting more through other sources to get to that magic 30 billion the Treasury has to raise every year, we need to think about that a bit more creatively. But the other one, and this is comes from a board discussion yesterday in various conversations, if we think about long-term reform, look, we are all determined to meet this commitment to carbon zero. And actually the government set out 2050 is our target. Rachel and Westminster have been very bold. They set out 2040 for the City of Westminster to be carbon zero as a city. And that's really ambitious and really bold. And we all, property owners, occupiers, we all coalesce around that commitment. So maybe some more lateral thinking is, how do we get that commitment to carbon zero into the tax system in this country? How do we incentivize businesses to get there quicker, reaching zero carbon, whether they're occupiers, developers, and maybe there's a more incentive through the rate system, through the carbon energy certificates, if you're going from an E to an A or whatever it is, because the system is already there, that actually you get a better rates incentive. And that would be interesting to explore that actually, and we think about fundamental reform. And I'll be interested what panelists' views think about that. But actually, it's something I think we could all coalesce around as a business community, whether you're an owner or an occupier, because actually we do want to achieve that commitment. And let's think a bit more laterally and more reforming, fundamental reform in the tax system in the UK.
Yeah, no, really interesting stuff. We can put that certainly to other panelists. Just before we move on there, I mean, I think whatever, and Tony believes this, but whatever solution comes up or whatever reform comes through, there will always be winners and losers. And NWEC's interesting because obviously you represent both property and occupiers, and you have that often that push-pull relationship with the side, two sides. I mean, is there any system? What is the system which is going to be most palatable to everyone, or is there always going to be someone who feels the victim here?
Look, I think, property owners want tenants that are viable and successful. Businesses want to actually make a profit and invest in their people and their products and their services. So I think everyone coalesces around that. I mean, actually, there has to be something around the online, and that sort of area in the sector is paying more than what they currently are. I think the challenge for retail is, 10 years ago, it's probably 5%, 0% online. It could be 70, 80% of their businesses. And Mark, I'm sure, will have some views on this. So we've got to find a way that doesn't penalize online retail, which is doing exactly what retail should do, is respond to customer changes, but find a way that there's a greater share of the burden of this tax. And also to Rachel's point, we do contribute a huge amount in the Westminster, in the West End. And not saying all of it should come back, but actually, if we want to keep investing in people, in the change of retail and leisure in this city, some of it should be retained, actually, because then we can actually pay more, ultimately, back into Treasury if the West End is successful. So I hope that's the direction of travel of this government and the Treasury, but let's see. They are used to U-turns, aren't they, and doing radical changes. So they've got precedence, this government, haven't they, in some of that.
Yeah, deeply unpredictable. It's fantastic. Well, Paul, you've been patient, and we've had a lot already said on this subject. So, partly, I just want to hear what you think about a lot of these topics we've already been discussing, and specifically as a property owner. And Jace was making this point really that that no property owner wants to see their occupiers fail, do they? And when we were discussing this earlier, ultimately, as a sensible landlord, you're there to help them, aren't you? But at the same time, you don't want to feel victimised in this relationship either. So where do you come into this?
Well, I'm not sure many people feel sorry for landlords, but that's maybe an historic thing. But we've been spending the last 6-9 months collaborating with our occupiers, and for Derwent London, retail and hospitality represent 10% of our income, and we've been offering rent-free periods and deferments, all sorts of things, because none of us want to see those businesses fail. For us, we see it as a really important amenity. We've been working very well with Rachel and her team about supporting that sort of the West End. So most property companies are in it for a long time and want some support. And rates have been a worry for us for some time. I mean, they represent, for an average office occupier, about 50% of their rent, which is an incredibly high tax. And a great believer, a strong London is better for a strong UK. So there needs to be a relook of how we do it. And obviously, deferring valuations and downward restriction on downward phasing and all those other things have happened means that those that have got high rates spend an awful long time getting back the rate rebate they should be getting. So it seems particularly unfair. And obviously we've seen some structural changes in society with more online buying and all the rest of it. There needs to be some sort of digital tax or something that's going to help even it up, because for people who are running shops and restaurants, it just seems an unfair playing field. And we as a responsible business, and something WPA are very interested in doing, we'll continue to support our office occupiers, and over the next 12 months, I'm sure we're going our retail and restaurants, we're going to have to support them more, but there needs to be there needs to be a shift, because it's untenable at this rate to have a tax rate so high, which doesn't reflect where the economy is going. We can make some adjustments to how we work with our occupiers, but government needs to be able to think laterally as well and try and support those occupiers, because an empty Oxford Street or an empty Regent Street, an empty Bond Street is no good for anyone. And getting London back working is an incredibly important aspect.
Yeah. And talking to your tenants, I mean, to what degree are they saying business rates is the reason why they're not opening their doors, that they are moving out of central London, that they are reconsidering their property portfolios?
It's been on, actually. I think there's a difference between retail, restaurants and hospitality and for office tenants. And actually, it hasn't been a big dialogue rates for office tenants. I think I suppose we've had a good economy for a period of time, but for retail restaurants, it's been a huge image. I think it's getting people back into London has been the biggest concern over the last few months, getting people, because we have to be realistic. We're not going to get the tourists we once had for a period of time. Getting office workers back spending money to Debenhams or Pret-a-Manger, or I'm not sure I'm encouraging my staff to spend money at Ann Summers, but I suppose I could. But it's just making sure people there helping the economy by spending money and getting people back into cities, whether it's London or Manchester or Edinburgh, is really, really important. But also not to have a tax burden that's going to stop or stifle growth, because that's not going to help the wider UK economy, and it's certainly not going to help levelling up. So I suspect it will be more of a subject going forward. But I think at the moment the focus has been obviously people's health and well-being.
I mean, looking at the consultation, do you have any worries that, that property, as you say, is not always the sector which people have most sympathy for potentially for historic reasons? I used to be property correspondent back in the day, and I remember it very well. So are you worried that the government might see the physical assets as the easiest way to go after future revenues? And clearly the digital tax is something which people seem to be more coalescing around that.
Well, I mean, the property industry pay quite a lot of taxes, whether it's through rates or whether, we're spending about £350 million currently investing into developments and creating jobs and Section 106 monies and all those other things that we're doing. Of course, London is a global city and attracts really international global money. And so you'd be careful what you wish for, because suddenly change your whole system and taxing the landlord, not the tenant, is not necessarily going to create the investment or the development you want going forward, or the jobs you created. I think it may be an easy target, but actually we need to think about whether it's a turnover tax or a digital tax or something that actually makes sure that every business pays their contribution towards society, and for people in the north or the west or where other regions. So yes, it would be totally decided. I think this idea of a sort of land tax has been around for about 150 years. I think some Liberal MPs thought about it some time ago. I'm not sure it would be the right solution. What is the right solution is to have a flexible approach and also reflect where the economy is at the moment, and where the world's changed. Mark's world has changed dramatically through online selling and all that sort of stuff. And there should be a focus on people there paying their fair contribution.
Yeah. Tony, I'm going to come back to you in just 2 minutes, but just to get a response really to what our other panelists are saying, and again get a bit more of a view from you about what's happening inside Whitehall. But first of all, Mark, I'd like to come to you just to talk about the online sales tax, because obviously Debenhams and Ann Summers have both physical and online platforms, and increasingly, I'm sure I'd love to hear about what those percentages look like. But for you, how does an online sales tax look? I mean, is that an attractive thing to go forward with, or was that something you'd like to people reconsider going forward with?
Yeah, certainly, Dan. Without a doubt, a digital tax is part of the solution going forwards. The pure play retailers have benefited compared to multi-channel bricks and mortar retailers for many years, and it's not a fair platform given the dynamics in the industry. So without a doubt, that is part of the solution. I don't want to suggest it should all be diverted into that as a solution. That wouldn't be fair or appropriate either. I'd echo a couple of the comments from Jace earlier. I think there is an element of variable tax across all of retail, whether it's additional VAT, I think is probably the easiest way to collect. I'm not sure a local sales tax would just cause a lot of cost and burden to set up system changes to put that into effect. A higher rate of VAT is much easier to implement, and so across both measures would be appropriate and fair. I would say there's a wider part to this whole system, whether it is slightly more corporation tax, whether it's a higher level of income tax. We need to look at it more broadly than just focus on retail and changing the element of tax being borne by retailers if a lot of those businesses are already cash constrained. But without a doubt, the online digital tax has to be part of the future changes. And I think for all the businesses that I'm involved with, there's an acceptance of that.
Interesting. Tony, I mean, we can come back to you. I mean, there's obviously been a lot of discussions about potential alternatives, and it'd be great to hear your thoughts, firstly, about how business rates reforms fit in with those wider taxation ideas, and indeed the ongoing reviews around things like TfL funding, Crossrail, SILS, and so on, as well as the sort of ideas that we've come through already with like VAT. So great to get your views on that initially, but then also I'd love to hear about what you're hearing from the officials that you're speaking to within Whitehall about how seriously they are taking this debate, whether or not they're serious about reform this time, and if it's just off the agenda, given what we always hear, this cliche, the bandwidth of government isn't there at the moment. But just to start off with, I mean, how does this all fit in with the wider taxation debate?
Well, it's a cool question because, of course, notwithstanding COVID-19, there's a sort of freestanding and separate debate going on out there, particularly, I think, amongst Conservative members of Parliament, therefore the government party, about, I think on balance, they don't want any extra taxes on anything. I think they want, nor indeed any spending cuts. So, I mean, the Chancellor is in a very complicated position of having to try to reduce the spectacular levels of deficit contributing to the national debt with a political party whose leadership wants to spend more and whose MPs want to tax no more or want to tax less. So this is all against that complicated national political backdrop. But I do think this is the biggest political event and the biggest public health event, and it will change the way we all think about the state. There's nothing like it since 1945. This is going to have profound impacts on the way we think about the state, taxation, and everything. And I have no idea how that will turn out, but it will undoubtedly occur. And against that backdrop, I think there's a greater chance of getting a reform of business rates, providing, in a sense, the thing doesn't, in the end, yield any less money than before. I don't think the online world has that many friends. What it does have is spectacular power internationally, and it's very hard for any one country, given that some of these online companies now have turnovers bigger than many nation states, it's quite hard for one country alone to venture into online taxation, and we've seen that already. So I do think there is an opportunity to make a reform. But I would say one thing, I think, and I'm not saying this just because Rachel's on the call, I think the London boroughs, Westminster and its neighbours, have been pretty creative in trying to think through what sort of world they wish to protect and what kind of economy they want on the other side of this. I think that the further up you go, the further up one goes in government, I think they're so overwhelmed by the short-term difficulties of dealing with COVID-19 that there's not much agency, not much sense that politicians are thinking, what do we want to deliver by way of policy a year, 5 years, 10 years out? What kind of economy do we want and how we deliver it? I think there's a great deal of wait and see. And the trouble with wait and see is that the economy will sort of accidentally reform, having impacts for planning and what's developed in Westminster and so on. Now, so I think that, my message would be, to politicians, there are opportunities for good reform, and I would say reforming business rates is a good reform, but government at all levels needs to keep in mind the question of what kind of economy do we want at the end of all of this, and then to deliver policy that delivers that. And I don't think we're anywhere near that at the anything other than the local level at the moment. I hope that's an answer to the question. Dan, you're muted.
Apologies. Yeah, absolutely true. I was just saying, you know, it feels like the government's just making policy week to week and often reversing that policy on the weekly basis. So I mean, we do know that the government will have to raise taxes, and it might be personal taxes, it might be raising money through the triple lock. You know, there are for them unappetizing decisions to be made on how to restore the nation's balance sheet back to normal. And we also know that they've come in on a levelling up agenda, which London doesn't really get much of a mention. So are you worried that these things are playing against Westminster and the centre of London?
I mean, on the levelling up agenda, I mean, the difficulty for government there is, and again, I have some sympathy. I'm the last person to criticise the government. I genuinely think the government's trying its best. The difficulty is its best is a very difficult, I don't think an opposition party in government would necessarily have found it much easier, but the government is the government. So, and I think when it comes to the levelling up agenda, I mean, the difficulty is neither we nor the government know what the economy of the United Kingdom will be and where it will be functioning most effectively, most productively at the end of all of this. As of today, it doesn't look to me as if city centres are going to be as producing as much economic output and productivity at the end of all of this as they were in January. Now, I think there's a bigger issue. I don't want to go on to this today. My fear is that without deliberate policy intervention, we will see an enormous incentive for sprawl, economic activity spreading out, a sort of what I've called elsewhere a Los Angelesification of London, which would be very bad for the green belt and not necessarily very good for productivity, which is why policy can determine the end point. But in terms of levelling up, where would you be levelling up to and from, given we don't know what the economy is going to be like at the end of all of this? I mean, you can go on with pretending it's still January, but I've no idea what the economy will look like in 3 years' time and where we'll need to level up or down to. Just one final thought, then I'll keep quiet. I can see that there's a risk in all of this. If the London economy were to suffer in the long term, people will still want to live in the nice housing in the City of Westminster and Kensington and Camden and so on. But there are other less well-off parts of London who I don't think would gain out of a move of the economy away from London. As I've said before, the narrative about levelling up always contained within it a sense that somehow the rich of Barking and Dagenham need to be made less well off in order that poor of, now you name your rich district in the Midlands and the North, are helped. There are lots of very deprived people in London, including in the City of Westminster.
Yeah, no, indeed. And Rachel, I mean, just to come to back to you, the poll results have come in about what Westminster should do with the money, the 4%, and it's basically keep it. There's this overwhelming majority of people think that. So you've obviously got a lot of your council workers watching this and voting, no doubt. So, so first of all, a response to that, but also to what Tony was saying. I mean, what is the long-term future of the centre of London? Do you think is there a danger of this Los Angelesification of, if that's the phrase, of the capital? And what is the future of the city? Is it a retail district? Is it more of a residential district? I mean, how can you see the economy evolve given the shock we've had, but also the long-term vision that you have within the council?
Well, first on the it's good to see the poll actually, and I think what the poll showed is that more people want to have more control of business rates being reinvested locally to support so the businesses who are actually delivering the revenues, the income, more of that should be able to be reinvested locally to help us to support the local businesses, to invest in the public realm, to run all the city management services, to attract people back in. So I think that is absolutely what I would expect. That is it's not a black and white. We all understand that sadly we're not going to keep the whole 2.4 billion if we get back to that figure, but that more of it should be reinvested locally to support the growth of the business sector locally. I mean, and on that point, I would say, I think we've all talked a lot about, and I hope there's an agreement in terms of the need to really seriously look at an online sales tax option, which has to be the way forward. But it's not an either or, and that would be a national system. And I would support some kind of hybrid option so that there's also a local element to it, so that you have got that local connection and the business rates that are being driven locally being reinvested locally as well. And I agree with Jace. I think, you know, we do need to look at how we how we use the changes to support the long-term, the situation that we're in, and the reforms to support the long-term changes that we want to see in our economy. We're looking, as he will know, at all sorts of emissions-based parking charges, etc. And I think that's exactly the same sort of route that we need to look at across the board. So I agree with Jace that we should be looking at a business rate system that supports those businesses to be much more environmentally sustainable. It's what our residents want. It's what we want for our city, and so we should be reflecting that. In terms of our city centres, I think there's a long-term debate to be had around this. Personally, I think it will probably take some time before the city centres return to the levels that they were at before. We all know that they've taken a harder hit, but they will return. I'm very confident that the areas of central London, particularly the West End, as we're talking about today, these are iconic, beautiful streets. They will retain their allure, their attraction. But I think it means that we need to be much more ambitious. So the Oxford Street District programme, which Jace is very familiar with, we're reviewing all aspects of that. We're absolutely committed to the investment, but we need to be even more ambitious to say, how can we really support this area as an attraction so that people will want to come into the area as an experience, as a wonderful day out, not just to go shopping, but to enjoy the whole area. So I think what this is doing is and we must, Tony's right, we must all be creative and look at how we can really use some of the, it's awful to talk about opportunities from this period, but it does enable us to be much more ambitious, to accelerate certain things, and to really push on some of the agendas that we already have in place, to be much more ambitious.
Yeah, no, brilliant. And Paul, Jace, just to come to you to conclude, because we're 2 minutes left, and it'd be great to just have a couple of thoughts from both of you. I mean, coming to what Rachel was saying about the future of London, future cities, I mean, are you kind of confident that post-COVID London can bounce back? Paul, first of all, coming to you. I mean, how do you think?
Very much. If I travel the world, they ask me where I'm from. I don't say England or Great Britain, United Kingdom. I say I'm from London. Right? Everyone knows London, and anywhere in the world they love London. If you think about the great culture it's got, the theatres, the museums, the restaurants, the retail, we've got to celebrate what we've got and make sure that we don't destroy it. We've got a short-term pain that we've got to go through, but we can do that through collaboration. We need some help from government in respect to a number of issues, one of which is sorting out rates, but let's not start decrying London, because London is one of the greatest cities in the world, and we've got to celebrate it and help it where it needs some help. So that's my comment.
Jason, I'm going to give you the pleasure of the final comment before I have to wrap up the session, because I know Tony has to run off to give a lecture at 12 o'clock, and I'm sure others have got things to do and business to run. So, Jason, just to conclude, I mean, coming to what Paul was saying, this is clearly a challenge for London, but I mean, how long is it going to take to see that recovery come into effect?
Look, the West End's been around for 300 years, much longer than all of us, and it's evolved and it's changed over that time. And actually, we've had a fantastic commitment, on the policy agenda by the city, Rachel's ambition. So I think that we need to pivot and be innovative and really ambitious. And it's great to hear that. And actually, going back to 2019 would be a failure as well, actually, because some of these changes were structural and happening way before COVID. So let's even go further in the future. And let's just remember, in retail and leisure and hospitality, this is a people business. And gosh, they're going to go through fundamental change in terms of the skills they need, and actually how can we really help them adapt to the new world, the new economy of Britain as well. So let's not forget about the people as well as the built environment and the taxes that we're facing as well.
Fantastic. Well, I'm glad I managed to end on a positive and sort of, forward-looking note, because it has such a difficult 6 months, and I suspect another difficult 6 months to go running up to the April date and beyond. So, a lot of challenges out there, but, hopefully a lot of ideas for the future, ideas about how to take through the London economy and indeed the UK economy now as well. I mean, clearly it feels like there's ideas coalescing around this idea of a digital sales tax or some sort of hybrid model, alongside other ideas which Jace brought up in terms of, looking at the carbon side of things. And indeed, as we're discussing with the VAT ideas as well. So lots to put into the government consultation, and hopefully we'll see some action from ministers and from officials in due course. Perhaps first, an extension of the holiday might be in order. But wait to see. I'm sure the guys will be on top of this, and we'll be reporting back in due course. And hopefully, I'll be reporting it in the Financial Times too. But all that leaves it up to me to say thank you to all our speakers. They've been fantastic today. Really interesting thoughts, really interesting ideas. I've taken lots of notes. So very grateful myself. And we'll see you soon. Thanks so much for joining.
Huge thanks there, Dan. Bye-bye.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Bye.